You're standing in an open field and someone's about to throw a rock at your face. You have 3 seconds to grab a letter from the alphabet to use as a shield. Which do you pick? Most people would panic and grab whatever's closest, which is how you end up holding a lowercase I while a stone smashes through its pathetic dot and breaks your nose. The human instinct to grab the first thing available is exactly what gets you killed in letter-based combat situations, which is why we need to talk about which letters actually work as shields and which ones are just elaborate ways to get injured while looking stupid. 10. I. The letter I is what happens when someone designs a shield but forgets what shields are supposed to do. It's a vertical line. That's it. You're holding a pencil against an incoming projectile and hoping geometry works in your favor. Spoiler, it doesn't. The attack surface area is whatever the width of the serif is, assuming you even grabbed an uppercase I with serifs, which you probably didn't because you panicked. A lowercase I is even worse because now you've got that stupid dot floating above the main body like a tiny satellite that does nothing except give your attacker a secondary target. Oh good, you think. At least I have this dot for... What exactly? The dot blocks nothing. The stem blocks nothing unless the rock is traveling in a perfectly vertical line, which it won't be because physics exists. People who choose I are the same people who bring a knife to a gunfight, except the knife is actually a toothpick, and the gunfight is just someone throwing pebbles. You're essentially holding up a finger and saying, "Please don't hurt me," except the finger is made of Times New Roman and has the structural integrity of a bookmark. 9. L. L is what you get when I realizes it needs to do more but still refuses to commit. It's got that horizontal base now, which sounds promising until you remember that projectiles don't typically come from directly below you, unless you're being attacked by a mole with a catapult. The vertical part has the same problems as I, meaning it blocks nothing from the front, and the horizontal part only matters if someone's throwing rocks at your feet, which they're not because that's a terrible attack strategy. You're holding an angle, a 90-degree angle. Congratulations, you've turned geometry into a failed defense mechanism. The only scenario where L works is if you orient it like a hockey stick and try to deflect the incoming rock. But now you're relying on your reaction time and hand-eye coordination, which, let's be honest, if those were any good, you wouldn't be standing in a field getting rocks thrown at you. The gap between the vertical and horizontal parts creates a perfect window for projectiles to sail through, and when they do, you'll be standing there holding your L-shaped shame while bleeding from the forehead. At least I has the excuse of being minimalist. L tried to be better and failed harder. 8. T. T gives you a horizontal crossbar at the top, which would be great if attacks only came at head height and you had perfect timing. You don't. The crossbar is too narrow to block anything wider than a marble, and the vertical stem still has that same I problem, where it's basically invisible from certain angles. What T really excels at is giving you false confidence. You see that horizontal piece and think, protection. But what you're actually holding is a lowercase cross that can't even save you from minor debris. If you angle it wrong, the crossbar becomes completely useless, and you're back to holding a vertical line like some kind of I sympathizer. The only advantage T has over I and L is that you can potentially catch a projectile in the negative space if you get incredibly lucky. But relying on negative space for defense is like relying on the gaps between your fingers to stop water. It doesn't work. You just end up wet and disappointed. Except instead of wet, you're concussed. And instead of disappointed, you're unconscious. People always want to talk about how T is versatile because it's used in so many words. But we're not spelling here. We're blocking rocks. And T can't do that any better than a fly swatter can stop a truck. 7. V. V is the first letter that understands angles might actually matter. You've got 2 diagonal lines meeting at a point, creating a wedge shape that could theoretically deflect impacts if you hold it point up. The problem is, theoretically is doing a lot of work in that sentence. In practice, you're holding a funnel that directs projectiles straight into your face. If the rock hits anywhere on the inner surface of the V, it's going to slide down those angled sides and nail you right in the chest, like a sad Newton's cradle demonstration. The only way V works is if you hold it point down and hope the rock hits one of the outer edges and deflects away. But now you're relying on precision aiming from both you and your attacker, which is not how defensive equipment should work. Real shields don't require you to calculate trajectories. Real shields just exist in front of your face and stop things. V makes you do trigonometry under pressure. The coverage area is also terrible because those two lines leave massive gaps on either side, meaning unless the attack is coming from directly in front of you, in a perfectly straight line, you're getting hit. V is what happens when someone who's only seen shields in abstract art tries to design one. 6. X. X is V's angrier cousin who decided more angles would solve the problem. It doesn't. Now you have 4 lines radiating from a center point, which sounds like more coverage until you realize you've just created 4 separate pathways for projectiles to slip through. The center intersection is the only solid part, and it's roughly the size of a P, depending on your font choice. Everything else is gaps. Beautiful, symmetrical, completely useless gaps. Where X does improve on V is versatility in orientation. You can hold it at any angle and it looks roughly the same, which means you can't really hold it wrong, but you also can't hold it right, because there is no right way to hold a letter that's 80% empty space. Some people argue X could work as a catching mechanism, where the rock gets trapped in one of the 4 triangular sections. But that requires the rock to have exactly the right size and velocity to wedge itself in there without bouncing out or just passing straight through. You're basically hoping for a hole-in-one while someone's actively trying to injure you. The X people are the optimists, who think if they just believe hard enough, physics will bend in their favor. It won't. 5. A. A is the first letter that looks like it was designed by someone who's seen an actual shield before. You've got a triangular top section and a horizontal crossbar that provides structural support, which is more than any previous letter has offered. The triangle shape means attacks from above get deflected to the sides instead of funneled into your face like with V, and the crossbar creates an actual blocking surface in the middle section. The problem is that A is still mostly outline. The triangular top is hollow, meaning small projectiles can absolutely sail through that gap and hit you in the forehead while you're busy feeling good about your letter choice. The crossbar helps, but it's positioned too low to block anything aimed at your upper face and too high to protect your torso, so you've created a weird middle ground defense that's mediocre at everything. If you tilt A to try and cover more area, the whole structure becomes unstable and you lose the advantage of the triangle shape. It's progress. Real progress. You're finally holding something that resembles defensive equipment. But resembling defensive equipment and actually being defensive equipment are 2 different things, and A is stuck in that gap between concept and execution, which, coincidentally, is the same gap the rock is going to fly through. 4. D. D is what happens when someone finally asks, what if the shield wasn't full of holes? The vertical line on the left provides a solid edge, and the curved section on the right creates an actual continuous blocking surface that doesn't have gaps every 3 inches. You can hold D vertically and cover a decent portion of your body, or rotate it to deflect impacts along the curved surface. The curve is actually brilliant because it doesn't just block, it redirects, turning direct hits into glancing blows that slide off to the side. This is the first letter where you could feasibly catch multiple projectiles without immediately getting destroyed. The weakness is coverage width. D is tall but narrow, so attacks from the sides are going to get through unless you've got good reaction time to rotate and track incoming threats. You're also still dealing with that open side, where the curve doesn't meet back up with the vertical line, creating a C-shaped gap that projectiles can exploit if they come in at the right angle. But compare D to I, and it's like comparing a medieval tower shield to a twig. You're finally in the realm of actual protection, instead of symbolic gestures. The people mocking you for choosing D are the same people who chose T and are currently bleeding. 3. B. B is D's overachieving sibling who looked at the design and said, one curve is good, but what if 2? That second curve creates redundancy, meaning if a projectile somehow gets past the first blocking surface, there's another one right behind it waiting to stop the attack. The vertical line on the left is now doing triple duty as a structural support, a primary blocking surface, and a grip point, which is efficient design. The 2 curves give you options for deflection angles depending on where the impact hits, and the horizontal middle bar connecting them adds structural integrity that D lacks. You could theoretically take multiple hits to B without the whole thing collapsing, assuming letters can collapse, which they can't because this whole scenario is ridiculous, but we're committed now. The problem with B is the same problem with D: width coverage. You're still working with a relatively narrow profile, and those curves create concave sections that could potentially trap and direct projectiles inward if you angle it wrong. It's also heavy on the right side, assuming letters have weight, which they don't, but metaphorically it's unbalanced. Still, B represents a massive leap forward in letter-based defensive technology. You're holding something that could legitimately stop multiple attacks without immediately failing. 2. O. O is the minimalist perfection answer. It's a complete circle. No gaps, no weak points, no angular edges that create deflection problems. Every point on O is equidistant from the center, meaning it provides uniform protection in all directions. You can rotate it however you want, and it remains functionally identical, which means there's no wrong way to hold it. Projectiles hit the curved surface and deflect away at predictable angles, based on basic physics. The circle shape also maximizes coverage area relative to perimeter length, which means you're getting the most blocking surface for the least amount of letter, assuming letters have material costs. The center is hollow, but that's actually fine, because you can see through it to track incoming threats while maintaining protection around the edges. O doesn't try to be clever. It doesn't add unnecessary crossbars or angular sections. It just exists as a continuous barrier between you and harm, which is exactly what a shield should do. The only reason O isn't number 1 is because there's a letter that does everything O does, but better. And we'll get to that in a second. If you chose O, you're not wrong. You're just not completely right either. You're the person who gets a 95% on a test and feels good about it until you see someone got 100%. 1. Q. Q is O, with a weapon attached. It's got all the advantages of the circle, the complete coverage, the uniform deflection properties, the ease of use. But then it adds a tail that extends down and to the right, giving you an offensive capability that no other letter offers. You're not just blocking anymore. You're blocking and preparing to counter-strike. The tail can be used to hook incoming projectiles and redirect them, or to jab at attackers who get too close, turning your defensive tool into a defensive-offensive hybrid that completely changes the tactical situation. That descender creates an anchor point that improves grip stability, meaning you're less likely to drop Q mid-combat compared to O, which is just a slippery circle. The tail also gives you reach, extending your effective range beyond just the radius of the circle. Some people will argue the tail creates a weak point, and technically they're right, but the weak point is positioned away from your body at an angle where most attacks won't naturally target it. You'd have to specifically aim for the tail, and if your attacker is that precise, they're going to hit you regardless of which letter you're holding. Q is the apex of alphabetical defense. It took O's perfection and added utility without sacrificing any of the core protective benefits. If you're standing in that field with rocks incoming and you grab Q, you're walking away uninjured. If you grab anything else, you're explaining to the emergency room doctor why you thought the letter I would stop a projectile. Choose Q. It's not even close.